North Atlantic, April 1943. The sea is steady, gray, indifferent, low clouds press close to the water, blurring the line between sky and ocean. A westbound American convoy cuts through the Atlantic in disciplined columns, hulls rising and falling in quiet rhythm. Smoke drifts thin from exhaust stacks, quickly torn away by the wind. To an observer, it looks routine. Predictable. Almost calm, below the surface, it feels different. German U-boats have been shadowing convoys like this for years. By 1943, many commanders still trust the same instincts that once brought them success: surface approach at dusk, quick torpedo spreads, vanish into the deep. The Atlantic has rewarded that confidence before. Inside steel pressure hulls, engines hum softly. Watches are changed. Men wait. Nothing feels urgent yet. Above them, American escorts hold their stations. Destroyers and smaller escorts trace invisible arcs around the merchant ships. Their crews are alert but composed, eyes trained on instruments as much as the horizon. New equipment pulses quietly. Bearings are checked. Bearings are checked again, then, without warning, a contact forms, faint at first, then unmistakable. It is the kind of signal that does not announce itself with noise or fire. It simply appears, and in that moment, an afternoon begins that will end very differently from how either side expects. The Atlantic. Before the turning. By the spring of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had already consumed nearly 4 years of the war. It was not a single campaign, but a continuous struggle stretched across thousands of miles of open ocean, one that decided whether Britain would survive, whether American industry could reach Europe, and whether Germany could keep its enemies divided by water. For the German Navy, the U-boat arm had become the war's sharpest instrument. Admiral Karl Donitz believed submarines could succeed where surface fleets had failed. Germany could not match Britain or the United States ship for ship. But it could sever the sea lanes. One merchant ship sunk meant factories idle, cities hungry, armies delayed. In the first years of the war, that belief seemed justified. Between 1939 and 1941, Allied convoy systems were incomplete and unevenly protected. Early escorts lacked training, coordination, and sufficient technology. Air cover was limited by range, leaving vast stretches of ocean exposed. U-boats exploited these gaps with disciplined efficiency. They attacked mostly at night, often on the surface, where submarines were faster and harder to detect than when submerged. Wolf pack tactics, multiple boats coordinated by radio, allowed German commanders to overwhelm convoy defenses before escorts could respond. When the United States entered the war in December 1941, the situation briefly tilted even further in Germany's favor. The American coastline was unprepared. Convoys were slow to be implemented. Coastal cities remained illuminated, silhouetting merchant ships against the horizon. German submarines arrived in early 1942 under what U-boat crews called the second happy time. Operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat, brought devastating results. Tankers burned within sight of shore. Sinking surged. For German commanders, the Atlantic once again seemed open. These successes shaped expectations. By late 1942, U-boat crews still believed the fundamentals favored them. The submarine was a stealth weapon. The ocean was vast. Merchant shipping remained vulnerable. Losses were acceptable. Victories were visible and frequent. Donitz's command assessments reflected this confidence. Despite growing Allied production, German leadership believed pressure on convoys could still force strategic collapse. Yet beneath the surface of those assumptions, conditions were already shifting. Allied losses forced change. British experience from the early war was being studied closely by American planners. Failures along the U.S. coast were acknowledged, not ignored. Training programs expanded. Escort construction accelerated. And most critically, the Atlantic was becoming crowded, not just with ships, but with systems designed to find what once remained hidden. At the end of 1942, the numbers still looked manageable to Germany. U-boats continued to sink ships. Patrol reports remained aggressive. Commanders departed on patrol expecting contact, action, and return. What they could not see was how quickly the balance of detection was changing, and how narrow the margin for error had become. Those assumptions would carry German submarines into waters that no longer behaved as they once had. The quiet shift at sea, the change in the Atlantic, did not arrive with a single invention or order. It came gradually, assembled piece by piece, often without dramatic announcement. For Allied sailors, it felt less like a revolution and more like a tightening discipline, a growing sense that the ocean was becoming knowable. By late 1942, the United States Navy had absorbed hard lessons from its early failures. Convoy systems along the American coast were formalized and enforced. Merchant ships no longer sailed independently by default. Escorts were assigned in layers, with destroyers, destroyer escorts, and corvettes maintaining constant patrol patterns rather than reactive responses. These patterns were drilled until they became automatic. Technology now reinforced those routines. Radar sets improved in reliability and resolution, allowing escorts to detect surfaced submarines at night or through poor visibility. Sonar, still imperfect, had become a standard tool rather than an experimental one. More importantly, sonar operators were trained not merely to detect, but to interpret. Bearings were cross-checked. Contacts were classified cautiously, then pursued relentlessly. High-frequency direction finding, HF/DF, known to sailors as Huff-Duff, quietly altered the balance even further. German Wolfpack tactics depended on radio communication. Each report sent to command risked exposure. Allied stations could now triangulate those transmissions, sometimes within minutes, guiding escorts towards submarines that believed themselves unseen. Once been the mid-Atlantic gap. Escort carriers began appearing with convoys, launching aircraft that forced U-boats to submerge and remain submerged, slowing them, draining batteries, and limiting visibility. Submarines that stayed underwater to avoid aircraft became vulnerable to surface escorts. Submarines that surfaced to recharge batteries risked radar detection. None of this eliminated the U-boat threat overnight. Sinkings continued. Convoys were still attacked. Escorts still failed, missed contacts, or lost targets in rough seas. But the dynamic had changed. Each engagement now favored the defender slightly more than before. American escort commanders were encouraged to pursue aggressively. No longer was the primary objective merely to protect merchant ships by chasing submarines away. Now, destroying the submarine itself became the goal. Depth charge attacks were sustained, methodical, and patient. New weapons, like forward-thrown anti-submarine mortars, allowed escorts to maintain contact while attacking. From the German perspective, these changes were difficult to quantify. Reports from patrols described increasing resistance but did not always convey the full picture. Losses rose, but they were spread across patrol areas. Some boats returned safely after successful attacks, reinforcing confidence. Donitz believed improvements on the Allied side were temporary or uneven, and that new U-boat designs would restore the advantage. As submarines continued to sail, they entered patrol zones expecting familiar rhythms: detection, approach, strike, escape. Many commanders trusted experience more than statistics. The Atlantic had been their domain before. They believed it still was. But by early 1943, the ocean was no longer empty between convoys. It was watched, measured, tracked, and when German U-boats moved toward American protected convoys that spring, they were entering a battle space that had already been reshaped, quietly, methodically, and without their full awareness. That misreading would shape everything that followed. Life aboard a German U-boat in 1943 followed a rhythm that balanced monotony with sudden violence. Crews lived compressed inside steel hulls, surrounded by machinery, fuel, and torpedoes. Air was damp and heavy with diesel fumes. Watches rotated endlessly. Men slept where they could, often beside the weapons they would later rely on. By this stage of the war, many submariners were experienced. They had survived earlier patrols when Allied defenses were weaker. Confidence did not come from arrogance but from repetition. Procedures had worked before. Surface attacks at night had brought results. Diving had provided escape. These habits shaped instinct, commanders trusted their judgment. Many had studied earlier patrol reports showing Allied confusion and slow reaction times. Even as resistance increased, it was often explained as bad luck rather than systemic change. When contact reports came in, crews prepared with focus, not fear. They believed they still held initiative, yet that confidence depended on timing and invisibility. Two factors increasingly outside their control. On the American side, the mood was different. Escort crews were younger on average, many only months removed from training. Few carried the long experience of European waters, but they compensated with discipline and repetition. Drills were constant. Roles were fixed. Every sailor knew his station during a contact report. These crews did not romanticize submarine hunting. They approached it like a problem to be solved. Radar operators watched scopes for hours. Sonar men listened through noise and interference, reporting bearings calmly. Bridge officers coordinated movements without shouting or haste. Fear existed, but it was controlled. Escorts knew that a single torpedo could break a ship apart. But they also knew their task: hold the screen, protect the convoy, and, when possible, destroy the threat. That mindset made them patient. Convoys by 1943 were no longer loose clusters of ships. They were structured formations with calculated spacing, escort sectors, and response plans. Destroyers and escorts traced overlapping paths around merchant columns, creating moving barriers rather than static guards. When a contact appeared, escorts did not rush blindly. One ship held the convoy line. Another moved to investigate. Others adjusted speed and bearing to close off escape routes. The objective was containment, not chase. These patterns did not guarantee success. But they forced U-boats into narrower choices, and in those narrowing spaces, mistakes became fatal. The ocean looked the same to both sides. Gray water. Rolling swells. Distant horizons. But by 1943, the way each side interpreted what lay beneath that surface had begun to diverge sharply. That divergence would soon be tested. Technology alone did not defeat submarines. It amplified decisions already being made. By 1943, American escorts carried radar sets capable of detecting surfaced U-boats beyond visual range, even at night or through haze. What mattered was how consistently those sets were monitored and trusted. Radar contacts were cross-checked with visual lookouts and sonar sweeps. Sonar operators, once isolated specialists, were now integrated into command decisions on the bridge. Bearings were updated in real time. Changes in speed or depth were noted and shared instantly. Depth charges were no longer dropped in desperation. Patterns were calculated. Attacks were adjusted based on feedback. If contact was lost, escorts circled and reacquired rather than abandoning the search. For U-boats, each of these tools reduced uncertainty for the defender, and increased it for the attacker. Admiral Donitz remained convinced that the submarine could still decide the war at sea. His doctrine emphasized aggression and concentration. Even as losses mounted, he pressed patrols into heavily defended areas, believing pressure itself would force Allied errors. American doctrine moved in the opposite direction. It emphasized coordination over individual initiative. Escort commanders were encouraged to trust systems and one another. Decisions were shared, not isolated. This reduced hesitation. The contrast mattered. German commanders often acted alone once submerged. Allied escorts operated as parts of a network. German intelligence recognized improvements in Allied technology, but often underestimated how completely those tools had been integrated. Reports noted radar, aircraft, and stronger escorts, but still assumed gaps existed between them. In practice, those gaps were closing. U-boats entering convoy lanes in 1943 increasingly encountered layered defenses. Surface approach led to radar contact. Submergence invited sonar pursuit. Radio reports risked detection by HF/DF. Escape routes narrowed with every response, yet many commanders did not immediately adapt. Experience told them that persistence would break escorts. It had before. That belief guided them into an engagement where persistence would instead bring exposure. By the time the first U-boat realized how completely it had been tracked, the convoy was no longer simply a target. It was a trap already closing. The afternoon the pattern broke. The engagement began without spectacle. Shortly after midday, an American escort detected a contact at the edge of its assigned sector. The signal was faint but consistent, holding a steady bearing beneath the surface. The report moved calmly up the chain of command. No alarms were sounded across the convoy. Merchant ships maintained course and speed. An escort was detached to investigate. As the ship closed the bearing, sonar returned sharpened. The contact maneuvered, changing depth, attempting to slip beneath thermal layers and background noise. The U-boat commander believed he had been detected only momentarily, an inconvenience, not a crisis. He adjusted course, reduced speed, and waited. The escort did not leave. A calculated attack followed. Depth charges were dropped in a tight pattern, not to destroy immediately, but to force movement. The sonar team tracked the response. Pressure hull vibrations altered the return. The contact rose slightly, then leveled off. A second attack was ordered. This time, the pattern tightened. Explosions rolled through the water in measured sequence. The U-boat attempted evasive maneuvers, but each change was followed. Within minutes, oil began to surface. Debris followed. The escort circled, listening. The contact faded, then disappeared entirely. The sea above returned to its previous calm, marked only by a spreading slick and scattered wreckage. No victory signal was sent across the convoy. The escorts resumed station. Procedures dictated caution. One submarine destroyed did not mean the area was clear. Less than an hour later, another contact appeared. This one was closer to the convoy. A second U-boat, drawn by earlier radio reports and confident in the confusion that usually followed an attack, had moved into position. What it did not realize was that its transmissions had already been detected and plotted. Two escorts turned simultaneously. The engagement widened, but it did not slow. Depth charges detonated in overlapping patterns. The U-boat dove deeper, pushing its hull toward structural limits. Battery power drained. Air grew stale. Each maneuver reduced options rather than creating them. The afternoon was no longer unfolding as German doctrine predicted. It was becoming something else entirely. 3 submarines, one afternoon. By mid-afternoon, the Atlantic seemed ordinary again. The convoy plowed steadily westward, merchant ships rising and falling in rhythmic columns. Smoke from stacks drew thin lines across the gray horizon. To anyone observing, nothing remarkable had occurred, but beneath the waves, the pattern of attack had changed irrevocably. The second U-boat had been forced to the surface after sustained depth charge runs. Its commander attempted a desperate escape, ordering a crash dive, but the escort sonar had maintained contact. Explosions rocked the hull. Water ingress began. Moments later, oil and debris marked the second loss, floating atop a patch of cold, indifferent ocean. Not long after, a third U-boat, drawn by the same operational assumptions that guided its predecessors, approached the convoy. Confident, it attempted a nighttime surface approach. The radar sets aboard an escort cut through the dusk haze. Observers spotted the conning tower first, then the entire vessel. Aircraft from the escort carrier had also arrived, forcing it to submerge while attack runs began simultaneously from multiple angles. Depth charges and hedgehog mortars converged in carefully coordinated patterns. Hull creaked and groaned under pressure. Escape options shrank with each attack. Within minutes, the third U-boat had been destroyed. Oil slicks and floating debris joined those of the earlier engagements, forming a quiet, grim testament to the effectiveness of coordinated American defenses. For German commanders, the afternoon was incomprehensible. 3 experienced submarines, well-led, aggressive, and skilled, had been neutralized in the space of hours, against a convoy that had seemed ordinary from a distance. Confidence that had once seemed unshakable now felt fragile. The escorts resumed station. The convoy pressed onward, undamaged. Silence returned to the Atlantic surface, but beneath that calm, the lesson had been delivered. The war at sea had shifted. Persistence and experience alone could no longer guarantee success. What had been invisible, now could be measured. What had been assumed safe, was now deadly. The stage was set for a new era in the Atlantic, a period where technology, coordination, and discipline would define survival as much as courage. Counting the cost, reports of the engagement reached German command hours later. 3 U-boats, each a highly trained crew with months at sea, had failed to return. Debriefings from surviving commanders painted a picture of confusion and unexpected resistance. Depth charge patterns had been precise, attacks coordinated, and aerial coverage persistent. Losses were significant not just in numbers, but in morale. Crews who had survived previous patrols understood the risks, but to see multiple boats destroyed in one afternoon defied expectation. German intelligence initially struggled to reconcile these losses with prior assumptions. Early reports underestimated the scale, attributing the sinkings to chance or miscommunication among escorts rather than deliberate tactical advantage. On the American side, the engagement was catalogued with procedural calm. Convoy commanders submitted reports noting contacts detected, engagements executed, and merchant ships maintained without loss. There was no triumphalism, only acknowledgement of duty executed successfully. For the crews, this was another day of vigilance, though quietly. It reinforced confidence in new methods, training, and technology. The wider strategic impact became clearer in weeks that followed. By spring 1943, the cumulative effect of improved convoy escort systems, radar-guided detection, and aggressive pursuit began to shift the balance of the Atlantic War. German U-boats, once the uncontested hunters, now faced a sea that measured, tracked, and responded. Sinkings continued, but the cost had escalated sharply for every success. The afternoon when 3 submarines were destroyed became a microcosm of this transition, the confidence of experienced crews meeting the evolved discipline of American naval power. The Atlantic, which had seemed open to exploitation, had begun to close in on those who assumed it could be taken for granted. The Atlantic transformed. In the months following that decisive afternoon, the wider consequences became unmistakable. German U-boat losses surged. By May 1943, the Kriegsmarine faced what historians later called Black May. More than 40 submarines were destroyed in a single month, including experienced crews that could not be replaced quickly. The psychological impact on commanders and crews was profound. Confidence in traditional tactics, surface night attacks, uncoordinated approaches, reliance on stealth, eroded rapidly. American convoy tactics, by contrast, were validated. Escorts continued to integrate radar, sonar, and HF/DF intelligence. Air support extended into previously vulnerable mid-ocean gaps. Coordination between ships and aircraft improved with each engagement. Convoys became not merely protected movements but active hunting formations capable of delivering preemptive strikes against U-boats. Merchant ships, once passive cargo, were now shielded by a network that measured and countered every threat. German command adapted slowly. Donitz ordered more cautious patrol patterns and attempted to preserve U-boat strength, but the strategic initiative had shifted. U-boats now faced attrition even before they could strike, and the confidence that had driven the Atlantic campaigns was replaced by caution, and, in some cases, hesitation. The psychological advantage, once German, now belonged to the Allies. Historians examining this period often point to engagements like the April afternoon as turning points, not because they were singular victories, but because they demonstrated a systemic transformation. The U-boat war, once dominated by initiative and surprise, became a test of endurance against a defender who could see, measure, and respond. The stage was set for the remainder of 1943. The Allies' growing control of the Atlantic, the gradual destruction of the wolf packs, and the eventual restoration of secure supply lines across the ocean. 3 submarines lost in one afternoon illustrated more than a tactical success. They marked the moment when the invisible war beneath the waves was revealed, and the hunter became the hunted. The quiet lessons of the Atlantic that single afternoon in 1943 was more than a series of sinkings. It was a revelation. It showed how warfare evolves, not solely through new weapons or bold maneuvers, but through the patient integration of training, technology, and discipline. The ocean, once a vast and unknowable space, had been measured, tracked, and turned into a domain where preparation outweighed instinct. For the German U-boat crews, it was a harsh lesson in overconfidence. Experience alone could no longer guarantee survival. For the Americans, it was proof that vigilance, coordination, and innovation could tip the scales, even against an enemy long thought dominant. The Atlantic became a classroom for the modern war at sea. Radar and sonar, once experimental, proved decisive. Escort tactics evolved from reactive defense to proactive offense. Each engagement reinforced lessons learned, shaping future operations and training. And yet, beneath these technical and tactical details, there was a human truth. Courage mattered, but it was fragile when divorced from understanding. The men aboard the submarines, and those defending the convoys, operated under immense pressure, navigating uncertainty with limited information. That tension, the invisible battle of nerve and calculation, defined the outcome as much as any weapon. In the end, the afternoon's events did not just sink submarines. They signaled the Atlantic's transformation. What had been Germany's hunting ground became a contested arena, where strategy, coordination, and adaptability decided survival. The war at sea had changed, and so had the way it would be fought for the remainder of World War II.